This is a wonderful book if you haven't ever looked at it. It's called The Four Spiritualities. It's by a minister and psychotherapist named Richardson. And he uses Myers-Briggs type inventory, and some of you may also in your organization have done, Kiersey-Bates temperament sorter. But one of the points Richardson makes in this really excellent book is that ideally people's self-care practices and regimen would be tailored to who they are as unique individuals and with respect for their temperamental needs. So in the same way that, we sometimes correct for other people's problems, we sometimes work really hard on things that are already our strengths, that are already kind of native gifts of ours. Sometimes it's good to deepen that. Other times it's really important to be conscious of what our growing edges are. There's also this very specious distinction which sets my nerves on edge about the spiritual and religious. So when I thought about what to title this presentation, Spiritual Self-Care, I had this notion that that self-care was a subset of spirituality, as much as spirituality was a subset of self-care. But this spiritual but not religious was really first articulated in the context of the 12 steps of AA. And I just wanted to revisit the language around the 12 steps because it is exceedingly religious language. It's theistic in its orientation, certainly. But it also has a spirituality that is definitely oriented to what's called the higher power or the God of our understanding. So the steps I excerpt here were 2 and 3 and 11 and 12. It seems to me that in a lot of 12-step spirituality, there is this healthy appreciation for both and. Prayer and meditation being spiritual and religious, and that these are not kind of mutually exclusive truths. The way they get set up, I think, in sometimes the more popular, less informed conversations about being spiritual but not religious. I call this spiritual self-care, but for some people, spiritual self-care may be really about religious grounding. So I don't want to fall prey to the nomenclature today that's really fashionable. Abraham Maslow is very well known for his hierarchy of needs, and the idea is that once you meet all your basic needs, then you would move towards self-actualization, and transcendence. Later on in his career, Maslow became increasingly convinced that these things were not, a pyramid scheme, but that they were simultaneously going on, and that even when people were not able to meet their basic needs, they had pronounced needs for self-transcendence, spirituality. And he talks a great deal about this in his little book called Religions, Values, and Peak Experiences. And peak experiences is, it's a psychological term for what might otherwise be called mystical experiences, and what in 12-step language is called spiritual awakening. And what Maslow says in this book is that people have peak experiences all over the place. They just don't have the time or the inclination to really notice them. And they don't create the space for them to expand in their lives. And that people who actually do create the space for them to expand in their lives invite more peak experiences. And that there's this kind of self-validating experiential quality to any peak experience. He talks about these things as being values, that people who have metabolized or integrated their peak experiences tend to both perceive and to practice the being values. Being versus doing, right? That kind of distinction we talked about from the very beginning. And that among them are kind of dichotomy transcendence, spiritual but not religious, prayer but not meditation, being not doing. And that when people have that sort of experiential validity and they have that internal sense of truth, there is a kind of self-sufficiency that they arrive at, which doesn't make them poorly related. It just makes them squarely located in self. And I think it's a little bit paradoxical to teach people spiritual self-care from this place of extreme inadequacy. Like, you need to practice self-care because you're all kinds of broken and you're lacking this and you're lacking that. And if only we could, fill that hole in your soul, then you might feel better. And of course, what this totally skips over is like a generative healing impulse. And Maslow says that when people have peak experiences, although they experience that as something that comes to them unbidden as a spiritual gift, that it increases their sense of having enough, being enough, doing enough, and that doesn't make them complacent, that in turn actually makes them generous. So how do you have peak experiences? It's hard to have them. The trains do not run on time, so it's hard to have them on a set schedule, but you can certainly create these conditions that support both the peak experience and also the appreciation of the peak experience. So a lot of this is stuff that is so hugely countercultural. It's like slowing down, doing less. Gary talked about screen time. I think screen time is a blessing and a curse. What does it mean for us to constantly be barraged by images and information? When are we sort of overfull, overstimulated, exhausted, spent, depleted? If you're exhausted, spent, depleted, you can't even take in what's really coming your way any longer. How do we practice these things that are countercultural in contexts that will not nurture them and maybe actively hostile to them? I think that's worth exploring. So here are some key ways to improve conscious contact in the pursuit of spiritual self-care. There are kind of broader ways of actually applying these practices. Lynn had asked me before we started this morning to talk some about my own self-care practice. One of my best self-care practices was actually a standing poker game that I had. And it was called Church Ladies Poker Night. And everyone who was in the poker game was either a religious educator or a minister or, worked in some kind of church or lay leader capacity. And it was a ferocious poker game. The language was not nice, the stakes were high. And that was so therapeutic for all of us who were recognizable as church ladies to be kind of rounded out in that context. And so, when I thought about what was my sangha, or what was my satsang, or, what was my company of the wise, it was really my poker game. So I want to offer the possibility that, a lot of you may be practicing this in ways that are not so pious. I think we get really distracted by piety. And we might be practicing them in ways that are sort of more earthy and unexpected. So are there things on the list that people themselves do with much success? Yeah. This is a reading list that's actually a pretty good general reading list. Like you could give these books to your congregants, you could give them to your clients. They were not, how to survive vicarious trauma for clinicians. Although those are useful books to read too. But I'm saying that sometimes it's really important for us to be the patient or to be the client and to not always be the helping professional, because that is not what being human means. Okay? Questions and answers.